Hi, everyone. Today I'm going to talk about ancient astrology. How did it work? Astrology is loosely defined as the study of the influences of heavenly bodies, such as the moon, the sun, the planets, and so on human affairs. Today, it's widely recognized as a pseudoscience, but in antiquity, it was a very well regarded discipline. It shared pride of place with astronomy, with which it also shared its name. Astrologia and astronomia were used interchangeably to refer to astrology in ancient Greek texts. And astrology was not distinguished from astronomy, which is the study of the physical properties of heavenly bodies, such as their size and composition. And that makes sense at one level. If you believe that astronomy is the study of the physical properties of heavenly bodies, it makes sense that you'd also include in that study the way those physical properties produce effects on Earth. And for that matter, in principle, elsewhere in the cosmos. But I mean, we're really interested in the way that heavenly bodies affect human affairs. And so, for that reason, astrologia, astrology, and astronomia, astronomy, were put together, and the names for them were used interchangeably. So, there is no better representative of ancient astrology than Ptolemy. Ptolemy was living in the second century AD. We don't know exactly when he lived, but we think he lived around 100 AD to 170 AD. And his book, the Tetrabiblos, was the most important work of astrology in the ancient world. Today, Ptolemy is known mostly for his Alma, which is a work of astronomy, and in it he laid out the first and only mathematically consistent model of the solar system. This model was the first that put the Earth at the center. So, what I mean is that it was the first and only mathematically consistent model of the solar system as a geocentric thing. Um, every other attempt to model the solar system as geocentric, where the Earth was at the center, in other words, it did not succeed. It was not mathematically consistent. That was true before Ptolemy, it was true after him. There was at least one earlier thinker in antiquity who actually rejected the idea of geocentrism, Aristarchus of Samos. He rejected geocentrism in favor of heliocentrism, which correctly put the sun at the center of the solar system. But this belief and we don't actually have any of his texts by him, we don't know his reasoning. This belief didn't really catch on. And so it was up to people like Ptolemy to try to vindicate geocentrism by developing a mathematically consistent model, and only Ptolemy ever succeeded at this, and that came in his text, the Almagest, which, as I said, is a work of astronomy, but Ptolemy didn't really see it as in principle different from the content of the Tetrabiblos, which today we classify as a work of astrology. For him, the two things just go hand in hand, right? On the one hand, there's astronomy, on the other hand, astrology. But in antiquity, there wasn't a distinction, and Ptolemy conceived of the Tetrabiblos as doing the same kind of thing as the Almagest. In the Almagest, he tells us the paths of the heavenly bodies around the earth. But in the Tetrabiblos, he lays out the consequences for human affairs that bodies have, these heavenly bodies have, when they're at different points in their paths. So the two projects fit well with each other. There were, however, different kinds of astrology in the ancient world, and Ptolemy developed only one variety of astrology. In the Hellenistic period, which was long before Ptolemy, so the Hellenistic period begins roughly in the late 320s BC and ends in 31 BC. Stoicism, as a Hellenistic school of philosophy, considered astrology to be a valuable tool for discerning future events, but they didn't think that the celestial bodies actually caused those events to happen. In reality, God simply made it be the case that the positions of the heavenly bodies would indicate to us that something was going to happen. So we can think of it like this. If you believe that heavenly bodies are merely correlated with some future event happening, the state of some heavenly body is merely correlated with a future event happening, then you're a Stoic. But if you believe that there's actually a causal relationship between the two, then you are doing the sort of thing that Ptolemy thinks of himself as doing in the Tetrabiblos, where heavenly bodies actually, in virtue of some property they have, they actually cause some effect in the world. So we know a lot about the Stoic view, for example, from Manilius, who was another ancient astrologer. Right, this Manilius writing in Latin, whereas Ptolemy writes in Greek. But I'm going to choose to read a passage from Cicero's On Divination that I think illustrates this idea. So in this text on divination, Cicero's creating a fictionalized version of a conversation with his brother Quintus, who explained. So this is Quintus speaking in the text. What sort of cleverness is it that you would attempt by sophistry to overthrow facts that antiquity has established? I fail. You tell me I fail to discover their cause. That perhaps is one of nature's hidden secrets. God has not willed me to know the cause, but only that I should use the means which he has given. Therefore, I will use them and will not allow myself to be persuaded that the whole Etruscan nation has gone stark mad on the subject of entrails, or that these same people are in error about lightning, or that they are false interpreters of portents. So, what Quintus, who again is a fictionalized version of Cicero's brother, so this is an argument that Cicero came up with that he's put in the mouth of his brother in this argument they're having in the text. And Quintus means that we know through repeated observations that certain signs are connected with certain things happening. So, Mars is present in the sky when so and so is born, and then that's connected with so and so being healthy and wealthy when they're older. That's a connection that observation teaches us. It's true we don't know how those two things are connected. So that's the whole idea from the passage of one of nature's hidden secrets. God has not willed us to know the cause, but God has willed that we should use the means by which the means which God has given to us. We don't know how they're connected, but we know that they are through experience. And when he mentions the Etruscan nation, what he means is that the Etruscans used the Etruscans, like many other people in the Mediterranean and the ancient Near East, would read entrails and divine some sign from the god in the entrails. And if you are saying that actually these divination practices are false, then you're alleging that the whole nation has gone stark mad, according to Quintus. And so the divination thing, when you're reading entrails, that reasoning, that passage shows us that this reasoning wasn't limited to astrology, right? We could say similar things about reading the future in entrails or interpreting some fact from where lightning strikes. And so today, since we know way more, we have knowledge of way more practices like this, we could say something like the following. I have no idea how the image formed by tea leaves at the bottom of my teacup is connected to my winning the lottery, but I know that it is connected, right? This is the view that we associate with Stoicism, right? And uh, Ptolemy's view is different, and the differences between his view and the view I just outlined are part of what made his view so interesting. Because what Ptolemy argues is that the heavenly bodies themselves are responsible for the way that human affairs go. Ptolemy wrote the Tetrabiblos because he thought he had discovered the scientific explanations for why human affairs go the way they go. And the right explanations discuss rays that emanate from the heavenly bodies. So now I'm going to jump into exactly how this causal relationship between heavenly bodies and some effects on humans and human nations we should talk about how this effect actually happens. And the rays that are emanated or given off by the heavenly bodies, they're super crucial and important because these rays are how the planets are able to cause their effects. Planets aren't willing people to be a certain way. They're not intending for people to be a certain way. They have effects on us in the same sorts of way that the sun obviously does. Just as the sun heats things by means of heat rays that emanate from it, the other planets can cause other effects. And that's the core of plausibility that made Ptolemy's account so attractive. It starts with an idea so plausible that it's hard to deny. So I'm reading. This is from the second chapter of book one of the Tetrabiblos. The sun, with the environment, is always managing everything on Earth, not only through the changes of seasons of the year in relation to the births of animal and the fruitfulness of plants, the flowing of waters, and the changes of bodies, but also through its revolutions each day, which provide heat, moisture, dryness, and cold in orderly ways. As I said, it's pretty hard to deny the point here. It's uncontroversial and obvious that the sun affects us. If it weren't for the sun, we'd all be dead and nothing would ever grow. Now, moreover, Ptolemy knows that the moon affects the tides. This was a pretty well known fact in antiquity. It wasn't known as early as Plato and Aristotle, but at least since Posidonius, who was born towards the end of the second century BC, at least since Posidonius, it was fairly well known that the moon affects the tides. So, if you doubted that the heavenly bodies have effects on human affairs and on the planet, Ptolemy would just look at you like you're crazy. Are you actually denying that the sun affects the earth and humans, or that the moon affects the tides? So, the question becomes, if the sun heats our planet and the moon controls the tides, what does Saturn do? What does Mars do? So let me read off to you two passages from the Tetrabiblos. Saturn in the east makes people's appearance be honey-colored, and Mars makes people unruly and militant. So those are two sentences. Now in Greek, when Ptolemy mentions the name Saturn, he actually calls it by the Greek name Kronos, named after the Greek god Cronus or Kronos. And Mars is literally Aries in ancient Greek. But and so if you think about why, for example, Mars or Aries would make people be unruly and militant, that's not a surprise when you consider that Aries is the Greek god of war, Mars is the Roman god of war. And so we could say similar things about other passages. For instance, Jupiter controls people's happiness, right? And each planet has a very wide purview. And so I don't want to read these passages and give the impression, the false impression, that Saturn only controls people's appearance, for example. Here's a fuller description of the purview of Venus, which Ptolemy calls Aphrodite. Venus brings about effects with a certain agreeable quality, in particular where men are concerned. She calls this fame, honor, happiness, abundance, happy marriage, many children, satisfaction in every mutual relationship, the increase of property, a neat and well-conducted manner of life, and paying honor to those things which are revered, or which are to be revered. So clearly Aphrodite or Venus does a heck of a lot, right? She controls your property, or she influences your property, honor, happiness, fame, your marriage, and so on. Clearly he is relying on some things from myth, right? But I'll turn to that in a moment. Now, let's bear in mind that, as I've said, each given planet actually has a very wide scope or domain or purview. Now, consider that each planet was somewhere in the sky at any given time. This meant that no planet was ever active in isolation, and particular effects that we'd observe, for instance, whether I lost the lottery, would be the result of all the planets working together. Depending on what exactly was happening at any given time in the heavens, some planets might be more active than others, but none was ever totally absent. So we have a lot of overlap between these gods. There's a lot of pushing and pulling happening between these planets. I mean, Mars controls militancy and unruliness. Venus controls romantic lives. And it's not difficult to see why Ptolemy thought that, right? He's relying on traditional or mythological depictions of the gods. Uh, Venus, Aphrodite, obviously the god of love. Mars or Ares, the god of war, as I've said. Um, Now, a second ago, I slipped and accidentally called these planets the gods, and there's a very good reason for that slip, which is that Ptolemy does want to rely on traditional conceptions of the gods as he divvies up which planet was causing which effects here below. But I don't want to give the impression that these all are actually the traditional gods who are pulling the strings on us mere mortals below, right? The planets themselves just naturally produce rays, just as the sun produces rays of heat for us. And these rays affect us at two key moments: the moment of conception and the moment of birth. Now, you might wonder which one of these two moments is the most important. And Ptolemy gives a very clear answer to that, which is the moment of conception is actually the most crucial moment. But the problem is that it's just way too difficult to determine the exact moment of your conception. And so it was preferable and easier to rely on the moment of birth. Note that even this had its problem in the ancient world. There wasn't much reliable record keeping and documentation in the ancient world, especially not for normal people. But still, Ptolemy thinks that this is what you need in order to make a prediction. The prediction might be wrong occasionally, but that's just because we don't have complete information, and there are so many different influences that we never want to speak about any given influence as exercising a decisive amount of influence or power. As I said, there is a lot of push and pull here. But if we were armed, for example, with complete information, our prediction would be really, really, really strong. But we need to recognize that it's very difficult for a person to know the moment of the moment of their conception. Um, the result of this powerful, quote unquote, scientific approach to astrology earned the Tetrabiblos fame throughout the Renaissance, during which time astrology was very popular. And his approach to the study of influences from the heavenly body was itself remarkably influential. Thank you.